Firstly, though, I should just say that this is organised, if that's the right word, by the aforementioned Progressive Christianity Network, PCN, which exists to support, resource and amplify the voices of those of us who hope to walk a Christian path, but recoil from some of the dogma and culture associated with parts of the church. We are a broad network. There's probably no typical PCN member. We range from, I guess, open evangelicals to religious atheists, if indeed that is a continuum. In any case, one of the things we aim to do is to create events like this, which can help us think more broadly about the world we live in and the traditions we're part of. If you've not already seen them, I'd encourage you to search online for our Made of Stories video series, a set of short films which open up even more interesting and engaging ideas through the lens of real people's lives. If you are a member of PCN, you'll already know all these things. If you're not, then I'm very happy to invite you to become a member of PCN. Or if membership is not really your thing, you can just sign up to our mailing list to be kept informed of events or other projects that might be of interest. So with all that said, it's time for me to introduce our speaker for the evening, Professor Linda Woodhead. Linda is one of the leading scholars of our time. Despite having a reasonably long name, the letters and words before and after it go on for even longer. She's almost become less of an individual and more of a sentence. But in all seriousness, Linda is a renowned expert in the sociology of religion, currently holding a professorial chair in moral and social theology at King's College London, where she's the head of the Theology and Religious Studies Department. Although I betrayed some of my own biases when I mentioned the sociology of religion, it's probably fairer to say that she's an interdisciplinary academic who transcends conventional boundaries in her academic and her popular-facing work. This is particularly evident in her writing. I shan't go through a bibliography as it takes too long, but her most recent publication, or at least the most recent one that I've read, is Unknowing God Towards a Post-Abusive Theology, which came out last year. In that book, she, I guess, dialogues with Nicholas Peter Harvey on a range of topics. It's a small book that really skillfully engages some really big issues, and I heartily recommend it. So hopefully that's enough of an introduction. Linda, you are very welcome here, so please go ahead and lead us in whatever direction you plan to.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon, for a lovely, accurate introduction. And thank you to Sarah, who's done a lot of organising. And thank you to everybody for giving up some of your evening to listen to this. And it's a real delight to be able to talk to you and have a lot of discussion. Simon and I are going to allow lots of time for Q&A. And we'll have pauses for that. And we're going to finish by 9 o'clock. If you are in the room with me, I would ask you to stick your hand up. And do you think Britain is still a Christian country? Yes or no? And it'd be very interesting to see. I don't think there's any way to do this on Zoom, but it would be very interesting to see what the balance is amongst you in your answers to that question. But have a think about whether you'd answer yes or no. And then you can check at the end. We'll check in at the end and see if you still would agree that Britain is or is not a Christian country in 2023. Anyway, that's the topic. That's the big question I'm going to address. And it's a very controversial one. So what I say about this tends to annoy people from different directions. I'll talk about that at the end, but it's a question that's fascinated me my whole career, and so I'm delighted to be able to talk about it with you and bring some findings together. I think that it's unpredictable how people answer the question, and that might seem as if we're confused about the answer. So there are some things that make us all think, well, this is no longer a Christian country. I went into Sainsbury's this Christmas to get Christmas cards, and I thought I'll get some Christian ones for some of my friends who would appreciate that. And amongst all the Christmas cards, there was only one set which said, "Oh, Holy Night." That was the only Christian one. So I realized that at Christmas, Christianity is a niche interest. which is quite a strange state of affairs. So anecdotes like that, experiences like that, make us think, no, it's not a Christian country. But on the other hand, we are often told that Britain is still a Christian country, and I'm going to share my screen. And I hope you can see those slides. Is that okay, Simon? In 2014, and actually he said it several times, but the Prime Minister of the day, who was David Cameron, said that we are definitely still a Christian country. In his Easter message, he said, "I believe we should be more confident about our status as a Christian country, more ambitious about expanding the role of Christianity and faith-based organizations, and frankly, more evangelical about a faith that compels us to get out there and make a difference to people's lives." And then he goes on, crucially, the Christian values of responsibility, hard work, charity, compassion, humility, and love are shared by people of every faith and none, and we should be confident in standing up to defend them. So very interesting that he identifies being Christian with a certain set of values, and I think we've got a clue there to our question. I'm going to come back to that at a certain point. I've just put up, so you can see them again, what he thinks it is that makes us a Christian country, what the values are that he thinks, these shared values, and whether you agree with him that these make us a Christian country, whether you even agree that these are Christian values. So that's David Cameron's take on why we are still a Christian country, though he's careful to say not only Christians have those values. So confusion, I think, even in our own minds, we sometimes think we're still a Christian country, we sometimes think we are not. And of course, being multi-faith, increasingly multi-faith and no faith makes the confusion even greater. So let's look at some surveys and see if they can help us answer the question. Well, the one that you'll have heard about is the recent 2021 census. You'll have filled it in probably yourself, and you'll have ticked a box in the "what is your religion" question, and we got the results very recently. You may remember in the news a lot of coverage because they show for the first time that under half the population identify as Christian, 46% of the population in the 2021 census. So the first time it hasn't been an overall majority. And the next biggest group, catching up quickly, are those who tick the box that says none or no religion. So on that showing, well, Christianity is still the largest religion, but it doesn't, a majority of people are not saying that anymore, that they are Christian. But it depends, as you all know, with surveys, on what question you ask and how you ask it. So I'm now going to show you some polls that I regularly do polling myself across the UK using polling companies. And here are some of the results that I've had when I ask various relevant questions. So one of the questions is here: which of the following do you think best describes the identity of Britain today? Please select just one. So a plurality of people say Britain is a multicultural country. Only 12% say Britain is a Christian country. So this is a national representative survey. The national answer to the question I've posed today would be, we're a multicultural country, if you ask the question in that way. However, if you ask the question, and some polling companies, not me, have done this, YouGov did this recently. If you ask the question by saying, do you think Britain is or is not a Christian country? A majority of people will tick Christian country if they're just given those forced two options. So it depends how you ask the question. And really, if you think about it, and the way I've asked it, where people tick multicultural, they're just being very empirical. they're thinking, well, in fact, we're not just Christian, we've got a lot of other faiths here now. And I've got friends who are Muslim and Sikh, or people down the road, and my daughter's married to a Jew and so on. So here we are, well, tick multicultural. You can ask questions in other ways, and here's another way. I've asked, which of the following aspects of British identity do you think is least important to preserve? And when they're given this, they're my options, so of course you're forcing people a bit. The highest choice, when they're given multiple choice, is Christian religion. That's the thing people think is least important to preserve. The monarchy is not far below. Christian values are more sort of highly valued. This is the least, get your head around, is the least important. So Christian values are important. Buildings in the countryside are much more important than both to people. Freedom of the individual and the rule of law are the most important things to preserve, that people really deeply care about preserving those things. Let me show you another way of asking. I asked the opposite way round. Which of the following aspects of British identity do you think it is most important, not least, but most important to preserve? Again, select up to 5. And it's pretty consistent. So freedom of the individual and rule of law are the most important. Then parliamentary democracy. The monarchy comes higher, strangely. Then buildings and countryside, tolerance. Christian values. Now, Christian values, again, like David Cameron, people value Christian values, but what do they mean by Christian values? Christian religion, less so, but 1 in 5 people think it's important to preserve it. So this is asking less about the empirical fact, what sort of country is Britain, and more about what would you like it to be in the future. One aspect of saying Britain is Christian, of course, may have to do with people's sense of institutionalized practices like public rituals and ceremonies. We've got the coronation coming up, but there are things like Remembrance Day, the Wootton Bassett things. And I asked, do you think that these things are important? Should they die out? Should they be preserved? Should they change with the times? Are they a complete waste of money? And you can see that the majority of people think that either that they're important and should be preserved, or they should continue, but they need to change a bit. So there's a lot of support. Britain likes its rituals. It likes tradition. It likes heritage. People in Britain do. And they don't like to change too much. So insofar as we are traditionally and historically a Christian country, people generally affirm that and don't want to abolish it. Only 3% want to completely abolish those things. In that sense, we're quite conservative. So if you ask people a question in an empirical way, are we Christian, and give them a range of answers, most people will say no, we're multicultural. If you ask them, would you like us to keep these things, they'll be a bit more positive about Christianity, but more positive about Christian values, and much less positive than about other things like democracy. If you ask about the institutionalization of Christianity in everyday practice and rituals, then they're more positive still. So that's enough of the surveys, but perhaps I'll pause, Simon, in case there's any questions before I go on to look at other dimensions of the question, other ways of answering it.
Linda, I wonder whether you could just briefly unpack how things like Christian values are differentiated from in your sort of survey work. how you're differentiating those two, or those multiple different sort of factors.
It's a good question, yes, because in a survey like the one where I put Christian values, like this one, Simon, you're just it's whatever anyone ticks that box thinks it is. So you're not defining it, you're just allowing people to say what they think it is. So it clearly shows us that people are more positive about the values aspect of Christianity than the religion aspect of it. What do they mean by religion and the values bit? By the religion, I would guess, they mean more about the ritual and maybe the dogma, they might say, and the sort of givenness of it like that. The values are more about how I behave. So people say, when you interview them, well, I don't go to church, but I'd like to think I'm a Christian. And they're meaning, I'd like to live my life in a way that exemplifies what I think are Christian values. But of course, we've left open here what those values are. And I'm going to come back to that question of, do we really still hold to Christian values? And is there such a thing as Christian values, or one set of them anyway?
That's really helpful. We do have some questions starting to come through here. One question on sampling, how you choose your samples, and a question you might ask answer at the same time about whether you ask if people value going into church buildings and other places.
Yes. On sampling, I work with survey companies like Ipsos or YouGov for these surveys, and they take a representative sample of the UK, which, if you're a statistician, you'll know is just over 1,000 people, gives you a representative sample. I do more higher numbers if I want to get a bigger view of a certain age group, say. These are internet polls, and they're weighted to make sure that they're weighted by age and gender and region of the country and socioeconomic status and various other things to make sure that they really are representative, ethnicity and so on. So they're pretty reliable. Yeah.
That's great. I'm just fielding
questions. Oh, and there's a question about, say the second one again.
The second one was, do you ask if people value going into church buildings and other worship places? Yes.
I've asked the question, have you had any contact with a church in the last 12 months, e.g. a funeral, a wedding, Christmas, Easter, or any other? And just under half the population had, under half though, so a majority had not had any contact. I've asked, what do people most value about the Church of England and about the Catholic Church? And buildings always come very high up, particularly the Church of England. So highest comes heritage, buildings, values, tradition. Things to do with faith and God come much lower down. So that's, again, people like the heritage, the buildings, the values, but not so much the religion, or what they see as the religion or the God part.
All right, we've got more questions coming through almost faster than I can read them. There was a question from Paul, which is being edited. How did the term public rituals include things like graduation, changing the guard, etc., or are we just talking religious public rituals?
Yes.
And just on the same question, the rituals question doesn't specifically ask about the Christian element of it. So we like all kinds of dressing up. So same sort of point, yeah.
Yes, there we are. So yes, I was asking sort of generally, because Wootton Bassett isn't Christian. The ones around Diana were and were not. Some were, some weren't. Outside Kensington Palace wasn't. Obviously, the actual memorial was. So it was trying to get at just public rituals and ceremonies in general. Are they important?
Great. How long do you want these questions to go on for, Linda? Because we've got quite a few coming through. I can keep asking, or if you wanted to move on, we could save some up.
Select me a couple more, Simon, please.
Okay, a couple more are coming your way. Could you say something about the different responses of people in different age groups and isn't religion, this I'm just sort of choosing one now, isn't religion a bit of a wordy word with lots of baggage and
Yes.
difficult to unpack through a sort of secularized world view?
Yes. Is that two? The religion one is absolutely right. I think religion, I've called it a toxic brand. You know, the word is not, people do not like the word. If you said, oh, my neighbours are very religious, everyone would be like, oh, poor you, how awful. You know, it's not, it seemed to be, and this may be something that goes right back, you know, centuries in Britain, religious, maybe to the Civil War. Being too religious is seen as rather dangerous and fanatical and intolerant and a bit scary. So you keep your religion, even if it's quite intensely important to you individually, you keep it a little bit under wraps. Because of that sense, I think, that is widespread. And of course, religious violence, Islamicist violence, and Northern Irish situation, and you know, all this has just continually reinforced that sense that religion's a bit dangerous and scary. And remember the furore when Tony Blair talked about his belief in God and people worrying that he was being guided to invade Iraq and so on by his religion. And Alistair Campbell said, we don't do God. That was a very kind of British statement. And what was second question?
The other one was, could you just say something briefly about the different sponsors from age groups?
Yes, that's really important. This is incredibly correlated with age, these answers. So your age makes a very big difference. And if you're older, you're much more likely to have been brought up Christian, to know a bit about the church and Christianity, to be somewhat more positive about it. The younger you are, the less those things are true. You're more likely to be non-religious than Christian, much more likely. And you're more likely to associate the Christian religion with sexism and homophobia. Okay, I'll go on then. So I want to look next at, we've been looking at things like, you know, attendance and beliefs. Belief is another thing you can look at, but it's hard to sort of measure Christian belief. But most people, if you ask about belief in God, a majority of people do believe in God. More people are keen on God than are keen on religion, that's for sure. And the level of belief in God is higher than you might imagine. It's not an atheistic country. Atheism is about 25% to maybe growing amongst younger people, near a third, but it's still not a majority view. So belief in God continues. Whether that is the Christian God is a very difficult question to answer, and it depends what you mean by the Christian God. If you ask people, do you believe in the Trinity? Most people won't know what you're talking about, so you wouldn't ask that on a survey. There have been lots of questions about Jesus and what people think about him, but of course that's contentious amongst Christians about what counts as orthodox in that area, so it's hard to ask. I think perhaps more interesting question about belief is about, let's call it cosmology. It's about, we've all got some view of the whole of things, you know, what's it all like? Where did it come from? What's the sort of nature of reality? And there, I think, I'm not relying on surveys, I'm relying on things we all know about and lots of interviews with people. I think that Christianity has lost its sort of metaphysical grip on people's idea of reality. So I don't think most people think anymore in terms of a biblical narrative view of the world created by a creator God at the beginning, and then moving towards an eschatological consummation. I think that's a very minority belief now. I think people think they talk about the Big Bang, they talk about an expanding universe, they're very impressed by the vastness of the cosmos and the fact we're a tiny, tiny corner of a tiny corner of a tiny corner. They talk about, I mean, they often have images of the planetary, you know, astrophysical images. I think that's the picture that captures the imagination today rather than the salvation history picture. So I think Christianity has lost out to science and scientific speculation in terms of cosmology. Probably true amongst many Christians too. And that's quite undermining of Christianity in lots of ways. Evolution is a whole other area, but I'm not going to get into that. The other thing to think about is people's, let's call it spiritual experience. In terms of people's sense of the spiritual, where they actually have a relationship with God or gods or spirits or ghosts or supernatural entities, is Christianity still, are we still a Christian country in that sense? Do people still, is their spiritual experience still shaped by Christianity? Or impossible to answer probably, but I've spent a lot of my career studying the rise of spirituality and magical practices in the open, and paganism, sorts of things that happen in Glastonbury, which is near where I grew up, so I go there a lot. But very popular amongst, say, student age. My students now do a lot of astrology and tarot. They've had a revival, partly because you can do a lot online now, particularly good for astrology and horoscopes. So this may be sort of, it used to get called folk religion, but, you know, common spiritual practices and things that were handed down and have always been here, not necessarily just new things, but of course there was a spiritual and alternative spirituality revival of holistic mind, body, spirit spirituality from the 1960s onwards that has had a big influence in terms of people talking, using the language of energy and chi and karma, and, you know, these terms are as popular, as more well known than incarnation and Trinity and worship and other words that baffle people these days. And I think it's very important. Things like mindfulness are very important in shaping people's understanding and engagement with the spiritual realm. So Christianity is still influential there, but it's got a lot of competitors now. There are some sort of common things that, so angels, which are common to folk religion, spirituality and Christianity. Belief in angels has been growing. We know from Gallup polling since the 50s, belief in angels has been growing, not falling. Belief in a soul has been growing, not falling. So belief in ghosts is pretty steady. So there are some things that that sort of are common to Christianity and alternative spirituality, so it's hard to separate them out. Finally, then, I want to come back to values, because this seems so important in what people mean when they think about and debate whether we are still a Christian country. And I've been doing a lot of work looking at values, because I'm very interested in how values have come up and up and up and up the agenda in public life. And I think it's kind of cut free from Christianity, is what I want to argue. Values have become a sort of quasi-religion in their own right. Now, let me take you back to David Cameron, and do you remember him saying that, yes, we are a Christian country because we have common values of responsibility. Are these Christian values? That's my question. Responsibility, is that a Christian value? Don't remember that in the Bible a lot, responsibility, but maybe there are other words I've forgotten. Hard work, is that a Christian value? Well, of course, Max Weber would say that's a Protestant work ethic value brought in at the Reformation with certain biblical texts to support it. Charity is definitely a Christian value in terms of biblical and support in the tradition and theology. Similarly, compassion, humility, and love. I mean, he's put them all as separate things, but of course, you will know they're not necessarily. It depends on the words you're using. So are our values still Christian as a country? That's what I'm asking now. Well, I think not. And I think this is where David Cameron's wrong. I'm going to put my cards on the table, because I think that, particularly amongst middle-aged and younger people, a new post-Christian ethic, a set of values that are not distinctively Christian have taken over. And I'm going to call this, I call this the live your life ethic. This is the new ethic. And I think it has replaced now, in the majority of people, the give your life ethic. And I think that give your life ethic was more distinctive of Christianity. I do not believe there is one Christian ethic, but I think that in the first half of and longer, probably the 20th century, a give your life ethic was very, very influential, and maybe in the Victorian period too. Now, I talked about values being more visible. They are everywhere. This is just taken from a school brochure, but you can see them in your workplace, you can see them in your church, you can see them everywhere being advertised. Corporate values, identity by values. What are the values? Well, in schools where I've done some studying, respect comes out number one. And I think that's partly because it's very useful for disciplining and so on. But, and we'll come back to why it's part of the live your life ethic. The research that underpins what I'm going to say now was done amongst Generation Z, that's people born after 1995, in a recent study which I did with 3 other colleagues, Roberta Katz, Sarah Ogilvie, Jane Shaw, and we studied students in both the US and the UK, and also non-students by way of social media and surveys. And one of the things that jumped out was how important values were for them. And so we looked at what values mattered to them. So that's what's given me my confidence in talking about a shift in values. So let's get back to the give your life ethic. Well, the late Queen is a perfect exemplar of what I mean by a give your life ethic, a life dedicated to service and self-sacrifice. And if you listened to the tributes to her when she died, service and self-sacrifice or self-sacrificial service, these were the words that came up over and over and over again. So it was widely recognized and appreciated. And here, this is much quoted, her famous birthday speech. And she says, I can make my solemn act of dedication with a whole empire listening. I should like to make that dedication now. It is very simple. I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. A life of duty, of not thinking of yourself, of putting yourself lower than others, and of serving, even if it's however you feel, and even at personal cost. That's the ethic, I think, that was very tied up with Christianity for the Queen and for many other people. And that, of course, is seen and was reinforced in 2 world wars, where the symbol of the heroes and of the worth of their death in combat was the cross, and is the cross. This could be any village or town in Britain. So the martyr's death, the hero's death, but this is the soldier's death. There's a sword. Look how the sword, you can see, there's a sword in the middle, the sword and the cross. This was, this is a melding of those symbols. So a live your life ethic. When I talked to older Christians, when I was first doing my studies and I was younger and they were still alive, they would often say, particularly the women, that you should always put others before yourself. It was very important to them. You don't hear that amongst younger people today. You can see this generational difference in the royal family again. They're good to think with. So the big difference, the clash between the Queen's values and Meghan and Harry's values, it's a values clash. They think they have different goods. The Queen thinks one set of things is good. Meghan and Harry think another set of values is good, and that's the live your life ethic. What is it? Now here I am. Some of you, if you really know your Don Cupid, who was my tutor when I was a student, will know this comes from one of his books. He spotted this ethical shift earlier than most people, and the black is quote from Don Cupid. And he says, this is a book called The Old Creed and the New. And he sets the old creed, which was about subordinating obedience to God and subordination of the self. The Christian, the old religion, he juxtaposes it to what I'm calling a live your life ethic. And he says the live your life ethic, as I'm calling it, this true religion is your own voice if you can but find it. And I've put in red the common thing you hear amongst people today: live your best life. Cupid said true religion is in every sense to own one's own life. And you often hear people say, you do you, I'll be me, you do you. We're each responsible for, we own our own life, and other people don't. We have to be responsible for it. And thirdly, Don Cupid says, true religion is productive, value-realizing action in the public world. And the phrase I hear again and again and again amongst young people and others these days is leave the world a better place than you found it. I think it's the same thing that Don Cupid is saying, or leave a dent in the world. So, as Don Cupid noticed, this isn't about putting God and other people first and yourself last, suffering, giving up, sacrificing. No, it's about being the best that you can be and helping other people to be the same and making a positive difference to the world. It's a different set of values. And notice it's not just good that changes, how we think about evil changes too in this ethical shift. So in the Christian ethic I was taught, the great cardinal or principal vice was pride. Oh, in Reinhold Niebuhr and much theology, it's pride. It's making yourself too big. And idolatry, putting yourself in the place of God or something else or someone else. And selfishness. Our parents always told us not to be selfish. The greatest evil now in society is abuse and cruelty. That wasn't the case in Christian thought. Christian theologians do not say violence and cruelty, or they don't use the word abuse. That wasn't the highest wrong in most Christian ethical thought. But for most people today, that is seen as the worst thing. And, the sort of unforgivable figure is the paedophile. And abuse is not allowing someone to live their life. It's taking away that ability. It's doing irreparable harms to them and their potential. So it's the flip side of what's good. So so I say from the cross to the rainbow, that the cross has ceased to be a very resonant symbol for people because the ethics changed. And the more resonant symbol, you saw it in the pandemic everywhere, is the rainbow. And pride has become a virtue. It used to be a vice. This is a pride parade. It's become one of our new public rituals. Pride, it's a celebration of who you are and diversity. The rainbow obviously stands for difference coming together in something beautiful. Different colors, one spectrum, one white light. So I come to my conclusion, Simon, and I'm going to sum it up like this. When I teach my students what religion is, I give them this mnemonic. It's not a very good one. Mises. Religion has these 5 dimensions: metaphysics, institutionalization, community and identity, ethics and spirituality. Religion isn't one thing, it's all those things. And so if we do a checklist now with, is Britain a Christian country, still in our minds? In cosmology or metaphysics, is Britain a Christian country? Do people accept the worldview of the Bible? I would say no, we're no longer Christian in that way. Is Christianity still deeply institutionalized in Britain? I would say yes. It's in the buildings, it's in the street names, it's in the landscape, it's in the calendar, it's in festivals, it's in a lot of language. I think these things are still there, and I'd be probably inclined to say mainly yes, but there are shifts and replacements there as well. And things like the coronation, of course, are a test of this. And then community and a sense of identity, either a local community and or a national identity. Is Christianity, does it hold those things for us? Well, in rural areas, in villages, it sometimes still does hold a sense of the local community. For the English, does Christianity still, is it bound up with English ethnicity? Amongst older people, to some degree, yes. Older people were much more, Anglicans were much more likely to vote for Brexit than non-Anglicans, because the Church of England is tied up with being English. So there is still that somewhat, but it's very much fading away amongst younger people. And Archbishop Welby and the current bishops in the Church of England don't like that aspect. They want the Church of England to be global and not national. So they're undermining, chipping away at it. And so did the previous archbishops. Values or ethics. Are we still Christian? David Cameron says yes. I say no. I think our values are no longer coming primarily from Christianity or reflecting its teachings. And spirituality, I don't know, 50-50. I think still a lot of Christian influence, but a lot of new and quite vibrant influences coming in as well, alternative kinds of spirituality. So my final point was, why doesn't anyone like that answer? Well, because it's messy. You know, the answer is, are we still a Christian country? Well, no and yes. It depends which dimension you're talking about. And it depends which, if you're talking about younger people or older people. And so it doesn't give the kind of clarity that people want, because this is a very ideologically loaded question. So conservatives with a small c want Britain to be a Christian country still. So people like the late Roger Scruton, people like Tom Holland, who's written a book called Dominion, the Daily Mail, they think Britain is still a Christian country because it stands for certain social and cultural things they like. So they get very cross if they think it's not. But on the other hand, secularists and other parts of the media don't like the answer that Britain is still a Christian country in some ways, because they think we should have secularized by now and moved on or become fully multicultural. And a lot of Christians don't like the no and yes answer either. And when I did surveys amongst clergy, they really don't like when I said most people think Christianity is heritage, tradition, values. The clergy put that at the bottom of their list. For them, Christianity is community, helping other people, and beliefs, which is not what, it's the complete disjunction between the clergy's view of Christianity or what's valuable about it and congregations and lay people. So when you try and say, is Britain, if you try and be like me, just try and be a sociologist about it, you actually end up in fights because it's also very ideologically loaded kind of question. That's enough from me, Simon, and we've got a good amount of time now for a bit more discussion.
So I have some questions have been popping up already, and folks, please do continue to put them in. I'll try and sort of fish them out as we go along. First of all, I should just say that the results of the poll that was conducted at the beginning of the evening have come in. 26% of people said yes, Britain is still a Christian country. 45% said no, and 29% said don't know. And it turns out that everybody was right. So, so well
that's
done.
nice, isn't it? We're all right.
That's very good.
What percentage said yes?
26% said yes.
Okay, so that's double what the UK as a whole in my poll said. More people here think yes than the average in the population.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
So can I start with some questions? And this we'll need to go back to the beginning of this part of the presentation and so start to work through, if that's okay. Okay. atheists believe in angels. This has been shown in research. What are we to make of labels like atheism, Christianity, in the light of the of data like that?
We just need to be cautious about them, because none of us like labels. None of us want to be labeled, except in certain situations where you're being forced to, or setting yourself up against something else. So they're obviously, we use them to as identity markers, but they cover up a lot of similarities and differences between us as well, and we kind of know that too. So I think the question is getting at that really important reminder.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm just going to sort of keep working through some of these, Linda. So just following up on the idea of values as a quasi-religion, it has been said that the NHS is the true British religion, and actually this kind of gets picked up a little bit later on as well. But in the first place, what do you say to that idea?
I think there's a lot in that it's sort of taken the place of the national church, because it holds the values of equal access for each individual, care for them. So there's a Christian value, care, but open to the diversity of everybody, treating everyone whoever they are, free at the point of need. And I think that's why in the pandemic, the rainbow symbol got fused with the NHS symbol. You saw that in people's windows and banners and so on. And I think that's very significant and interesting. Of course, it can be very dangerous to idealize something and make it your values container, because then it's hard to see all its flaws, which are now being very apparent. But yeah, I think it is a kind of a focus of real feeling and values and so on, which is why politicians can't cut it or bring in private healthcare.
It's certainly possible to blaspheme against the NHS these days, I think. Okay. Shouldn't we be asking not just about what characteristics we, that is Christians or anyone else, value, but instead where all of us can find the motivation to practice them? Now, that is a should or shouldn't question, but perhaps you could talk about where people do find motivation, and whether that's, well, I won't try and sort of prompt you on that. I'll let you answer that.
No, you're helping, because I don't know how to answer it.
Well, I mean, my instinct was to suggest that this might be some sort of question about capitals, but I might be wrong on that.
I'm not sure I can answer that one.
Okay, well, not to worry. Well, we might come back to it. A more pressing one is probably this question, which was pushing back against your use of the royal family as a sort of exemplar, and asking if it's not a better example to look to the examples of selfless service within the pandemic, for instance, of public sector workers, teachers, nurses, and so on. Is it? I think quite a few folk may feel it problematic to draw on royalty in this way.
Well, I don't think it's problematic because they're a national symbol. It doesn't matter whether you're for or against them. It's just culturally, they're resonant and it tell you something about the culture. That's all I'm using them for. I'm neither saying good or bad, but you can certainly use other things to look at what we really value and who we look up to. And the pandemic did, I don't know if it reflected how much we value carers, or if we suddenly noticed that they were important, because I'm not sure we do really value them. If you think about how well paid carers are outside the NHS, they're the lowest paid of all people. So we don't really value care, at least not in economic terms, which is significant, because care, selfless care, is a Christian value. And we kind of pay lip service, but we don't really value. And you can sort of see in the public sector all out on strike at the moment, a big question mark about how much that work really is valued. Is it lip service or is it real really seen as central to society. I think that there's a lot of talk and more that suggests that really we think that economically productive people are the most valuable, which is odd because people in the public service can be seen as economically productive, but they're not. So I think there's I think it's a very complex issue, and I think we're not terribly clear on what we value there.
Yeah, our values are extraordinarily complex, and perhaps that's one of the main things that you're pointing to in all of this, that we are dealing with areas of enormous complexity. But
we're very contradictory people, of course, as well.
Yeah, and we like to simplify things, of course. Makes it easier. A comment here from our friend Alison, who was taught joy, which was Jesus, others, you, duty being the key virtue there. I think that's just a comment from Alison, but if
I'm just writing that down because I haven't heard. I collect these, and I've not heard that one. That's fantastic. Exemplification of the give your life ethic. Jesus, others, you.
Yeah, right.
There's a whole list. Another is what's in the middle of sin. I am. I've heard that a lot from evangelical friends.
It's less easy to say I is, I suppose, but
yes.
Anyway.
Well, just say I. Actually, you're right. It should be just I, shouldn't it? What's in the middle of sin? I.
Can you make any comment on social media? Obviously, cultural change and technological change are really sort of closely intertwined. Do you think that, I mean, and I know this has something to do with timescales. I wouldn't be able to give an accurate timescale on the growth of social media, but in terms of societal change, do you think that social media is an important contributory factor?
Yes, we looked at this question when we did this Gen Z study, because they are the generation, Simon, for whom social media becomes very when they're very young. So they're the ones most influenced for the longest, and I mean, at an early stage of their life. I think it reinforces some existing trends rather than being creating new things. But one obvious example is that you post things all the time, so you're writing and expressing yourself all the time. When I was young, I was told little girls should be seen and not heard all the time. That was a very common family saying. No one would say that now, and little girls can make themselves seen and heard all the time on social media, whatever else is happening. And I think that does make a difference. So it kind of reinforces that idea that you have got the right to own your life, live your life, express your life. But that trend was there already from the 60s. It just reinforces that. That's just one example. I think it is important, yes. I think also it brings out how common abuse is. I think it's helped to bring abuse into the forefront, because you can suddenly see, to everyone's horror, they see not just online bullying and trolling, they see how much pornography there is, they see how much child pornography there is. Vast amounts being accessed by huge numbers of men. So a lot comes out that was hidden and makes people frightened as well and worried.
Absolutely, yeah, and I'm sure there's stacks of ongoing work on that. Moving on to a different tack, is there a way, this person wants to know, is there a way of putting the teaching and life of Jesus into the center of Christianity, which, and I'm sort of summarizing here, doesn't just fall into a sort of liberal / progressive and conservative split? Is there a way of simplifying or harmonizing the kind of Jesus tradition that doesn't fall foul of that binary?
That's an interesting question, because putting Jesus at the center of everything has come to be very identified with a certain evangelical Protestant move, which is very often about exclusivism. So we've got Jesus and you haven't. So it's been surrounded by that kind of approach. And the question's asking, can it be more inclusive? I think inclusive of whom? I mean, other faiths, other Jewish people. It depends who, how broad are you thinking, I think, about. And of course, the centrality of Jesus is a contested thing within the Christian tradition. I was brought up in very traditional village Anglicanism, and then I went to a Catholic convent school for 2 years, and I hardly ever heard about Jesus. It was a real shock the first time I went to a Methodist church and heard them talking about Jesus. It was all about God and the Holy Ghost in my Christian faith. So there are varieties here, aren't there? Interesting question, though.
Absolutely, and we all work within our paradigms, don't we? So just picking up on the idea of inclusivity, this one from Howard and Maria, referencing Jonathan Sacks, the late Jonathan Sacks. The quote is, "All who genuinely seek to learn, whether atheist or believer, scientist or mystic, are united in having not a faith, but faith itself." So I hope you were able to catch that. Faith itself, then, are we sort of societally moving towards a more inclusive understanding of faith more generally?
I always forget if Prince Charles said that he wanted to be defender of faith or faiths, plural. Can't remember which it was.
I think he said both, actually. I think initially he wanted to be, I can't remember which way around, but I think he said both.
Because he was onto this, wasn't he? He was thinking of a more inclusive understanding of what faith is. But faith is, of course, it's a very Christian word, so it's a bit sort of contradictory to make that the center of. I think that's why spirit has become it's somewhat more less laden with a certain baggage, but this idea of finding a common, it's hard to find something common because religions are very, very, very different. Hinduism's got a zillion gods and goddesses. I mean, that is very different from Islam. Religious studies teaches you that anyway.
It does indeed.
They're not all exactly the same. They really aren't.
Well, one of the things that you're talking about is this importance of values, which I think sort of comes through on that previous thing. But one of our questioners asks about the value of authenticity, which has certainly been a buzzword for a number of years, a huge current value. And his suggestion is, or his question is it a form of self-worship? Authenticity
is a very core value. That's completely right. It's part of the new ethic. It's not new because it was around for the 60s, and it's just got more intense. For young people, it's very, very important. I think it's to do, and I'm not the only person who's argued this, but the opposite of authentic is hypocritical or dishonest. And I think it's to do with a society in which we really value truthfulness and individual freedom, and that's been a trend for quite a long time. But yes, it's absolutely right that it's part of the new ethic, authenticity. Is it self-worship was the thing? It's often called narcissistic. What was the word that you used there, Simon? Something similar?
Yeah, I said self-worship, yeah.
Self-worship. It can be, but it doesn't need to be. In the way that people talk about it as a value, young people, they talk about just being honest about who you are. If you're gay, say so. If you're this, that, the other, say it, and find out. They see it as a sort of ethic to find out who you really are and live that life genuinely, rather than hiding it or covering up or not being who you are. And own your privilege, they'd say, you know, own the fact that you're a middle class privileged white person. This is quite a different way of thinking.
There's something here about loving oneself as well, which is, you know, is sort of enmeshed in this sort of question. This questioner asks, is love yourself the new way of saying you are valuable because God loves you? If so, is not a necessary reaction to the idea of a wrathful judging God, and therefore an expression of Jesus' values?
Yes, it is historically a reaction to the idea that we're all sinful and going to hell unless we're saved, redeemed by something outside of ourselves. I think it is a reaction against that. And it's to do with a more democratic society as well, and everyone feeling they've got the right to the same, you know, freedoms and dignity and all those things, and capitalism and everyone having choices and consumerism. All those things I think have fed into it, definitely. Does it come from, is it compatible with a Christian ethic? Yes, absolutely. Or theology, it can be. And Christian ethics has developed and changed around it as well. And you much more hear that God loves you these days than you don't hear that God is going to condemn you. It's very rare. You do sometimes, but not many churches.
Perhaps you don't go to the right churches, Linda.
I don't know.
Alison Webster again helpfully points out my mistake earlier on it. So that Charles said faith, not the faith, and I think where the confusion comes in is that he's had to change that stance a little bit. But here's another question for you, Linda. Can you comment on the year-on-year continuing decline in church attendance? I know this is something that you would have something to say about, and particularly the sort of the church's response to that. In some places, it's denial. In others, it's acceptance and a question of managing decline. Can you what comment do you have on that?
Yes, I have studied this for a long time, and the questioner is completely right. You know, it is relentless and unvarying. So every year, the decline rate is the same, and it has been since we started doing surveys. And I would guess it's been like that in Britain for 100 years. It's nothing new. And the reason it's so steady like that is, once you understand what the mechanism is that fewer children follow their parents into church. So children are about half as likely to be Christian as their parents. That's where it happens. People always think about adults losing their faith. Of course that happens, but that's not the big picture of change. The big picture of change is that the point at which your child or teenager says, I don't believe this, I don't want to come to church, or I don't believe what you believe. That's where the change happens. So it's a question about young people and why the faith isn't taken up by so many of them. That's where the question really needs to go. The church's response to it, yes, I think church leaders often are in denial. It's very hard, of course, to face that. It's hard to face it even in my subject, you know, the study of theology and religious studies, where there's a big decline as well, because it's not a vocational subject anymore. You know, it's hard when what you've given your life to is declining and not of interest to as many people. So I understand that, but honestly, openness and managing the decline and turning it into something good is really the only way.
There's certainly a lot of talk about managed decline in some places, which is something of a Marmite topic, I must say, amongst some church folk. Another question on values then, the value of leaving the world a better place. So if we were to say that's a key value, is that in fact so very different from a Christian ethic? How would you respond to that?
No, not so very different at all. That's been an emphasis, obviously, for many Christians. And there's a slight change in emphasis in that activism is what really matters to young people. And activism means that you try and change the world on the basis of your own authentic story. So, you know, if you are a Black woman who got to university and you're the first in your family, you might become an educational activist trying to help other Black women get into university. It's kind of related. It's related to your authentic person. It's got that kind of shift to it. But the ideal of wanting to do good and leave the world a better place is of course shared across faiths and no faith.
But the value of trust, has your work touched on whether society is becoming more or less trusting, or do you have any sense of that in any of the other work that you've done already?
I don't. I think it's impossible to, you know, empirically. I've never seen a good study of that. You can of course ask people if they feel what they think about how, but do they really trust more or less? That's really hard to get at. There's a widespread perception that children are more protected by their parents because their parents think the world is more dangerous than their parents used to. You know, so people say, oh, we were sent out and played on the street and came back when we wanted to, and I'd never let my children do that now. So there's more of a sense of threat around. That's often said, but I don't know if that's empirically true.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it's almost impossible to answer the question.
Yes, it's like, have we got better or worse, you know, morally? I just don't think you can ever measure those things.
Perhaps I should note that on your previous point about young people and the sort of the passing on of faith, I think Anna Strachan has done some good work on that recently that people might be able to pick up.
True.
Well, I don't know how you feel about a really big question, Linda, but I'll try you with this one from Tim. What is the good news to this generation? And you can answer that however you like.
That's a great question. What's the good news to this generation? The good news is that people are becoming more open to difference. That's what they celebrate amongst their own generation. They see that as a real positive thing they've brought to society. Whether that's true or not, that's what they think. On the other hand, they're very pessimistic about the planet, equality, economic progress, you know, a whole raft of things is not very good news to them. And they often talk about that contrast, Simon. They often say, you know, in some ways, I'm a really optimistic person, but in some ways, I'm so depressed about the way things are.
And that sort of that tension is really evident in a lot of people, I think, just in speaking to people in sort of in the street, as it were. Oh, I had a question in front of me which had just disappeared out of my eye line. Okay, this is a question about, well, it's a question about a number of things, really. I'll read it as it is. Do you think that Christianity would make a more active contribution to life if the church placed more emphasis on an active faith than indefensible beliefs? So I guess we're talking about here the way we live rather than some of the sort of the dogmas, etc. This calls to mind, I don't know if you've seen it, Linda, but a piece of, if I say research, it's not really what I mean, but it is what they called it. Some research by Christian Concern who talked about more children being in churches that hold sort of conservative views. Really good example of very poor research, very badly reported. But what do you think about that idea of the church needing to be more place more emphasis on active faith, lifestyle, etc., than indefensible beliefs?
I think there's no one answer. You know, if all the churches were more liberal and values driven, some people wouldn't want it. If they were all more conservative, a lot of people wouldn't want it. People want a diversity of things from churches. There's no one recipe that's going to work. Research, that's the main thing research shows over and over and over again. Some sorts of churches fit some sorts of places and communities and not others. To that part of the question. So the idea if they all got stricter, they'd all grow, or they all got more liberal, they'd all grow. Neither are true. I think that, and then there's also the idea, if they all were doing lots of loving things and good in society, would they grow? Not necessarily. Look at the Quakers. The Quakers have massive approval ratings, but they're not growing. So people think it's really good that people are doing that, or the Salvation Army. We really admire them, but they don't want to go or join. I do think that some people, not everyone in society, but you know, less than 1 in 5 probably, but really value spirituality. And that's what they look for. They look for, if religion loses sight of the fact it's about God and the divine and devotion, then it will always die eventually, because that's its kind of core business. So I think if people who want to nurture their spiritual lives go to alternatives to the church, that's very fatal for the churches. And so for the churches not to nurture their spiritual riches and tradition and teaching and beautiful buildings and so on is a real disastrous strategy.
A dangerous path to take.
Yeah.
Linda, we've had a few questions about the concept of God. I don't know whether you're going to be able to make much really sort of clear comments on this, but a number of people are asking what people mean when they talk about God. Now, this might be one of your messy answers, but can you sort of give us a little bit of narrative? What do people mean when they're talking about the God they do or don't believe in?
Well, lots of things, obviously, different things, but there are some dominant ideas, and one of them, I talk about this a lot in the book you mentioned, Simon, the unknowing God, because the argument of the unknowing God is that, which of course is a riff off the Cloud of Unknowing, which I love. The idea is that there are bad ideas about God that really stop people having a living spirituality, and we should try and get rid of those. And one of the bad ideas that I think is very, very common is that God is, we call it the omni God. God is omni everything. He usually is a all-powerful, all-loving, all-just, all-seeing, all-knowing, all-everything. And that's not a very it's not a living kind of spiritual relationship with that. But I think that's a view that people often hold who don't believe in God and who think about religion as, I'm not religious because I don't believe in that kind of a God. And it's not exclusive to Christians either.
And that's the God that does two people as well, isn't it? Like the God that can enact.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's the God that people blame when they want to shout at God because something bad's happened. But why do we think about God like that? What a monster.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, I mean, you pick your person to blame for that. You know, whether it's Aquinas or Plato or whoever it might be. Okay, I've got somebody here. There's quite a longish comment, which I'll just read out to you if that's okay. This is from Jayan. I am exasperated by the failure of church leaders to take the opportunity of large congregations of children with their parents at Christmas time, discuss how we can't be sure where Jesus was born and where his parents lived before his birth, which they presume is Bethlehem. Quite often, this is the last time primary school children go to church in numbers, and instead Christmas becomes associated with Father Christmas, whom they also don't believe in anymore. I don't know, it's not a question, it's a comment. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to say about that, Linda.
Yeah, well, I think there's a good point there that often, that sort of the kind of religion that ordinary people value gets looked down upon too often rather than celebrated and spoken into. And the idea that it's only the regular churchgoers who come on Sunday every week who are real Christians has been very damaging to the churches, I think. I understand it, but it's not traditional and it's not welcoming or helpful.
I think I'm afraid, folks, and I just want to apologise to all of those whose questions I haven't managed to get to, or did manage to get to and garbled. It's not the easiest job, this. I'm going to just pose one more question, Linda, and then we'll wrap up. Is there, in fact, an argument to be made that it's a positive thing that the church, in its sort of in its pomp, is declining? Does that mean that we might move away from the sort of the chauvinism, the sort of imperialistic, nationalist side of things, and drawing on your idea about decline? Does that in fact create space for whatever new might be ready to emerge in the sort of the ashes, if you like, of the old?
Well, let's hope so. It's a nice positive thought to end on. And the trouble is, it's very hard for people who've had power in an institution to give up that institution or buildings. You know, there are some buildings I know that have been given up in Scotland, for example, and they've found new life as people have come back into the church and carried out rituals and various things from different faiths and none, and brought the spirit back into the churches. So it can happen. It can happen. It doesn't always. There are some areas where that will never happen, and the closure will be a terrible loss and it'll go. But sometimes miraculous things do happen. The spirit grows in new ways, and those old stones and graveyards and buildings and histories are very, very powerful things. I wouldn't write them off.
Absolutely. Well, that is a nice sort of positive point to finish on. So I'm not going to take any more questions, folks. Instead, I just want to offer what I've contractually agreed with Linda to be called a vote of thanks for your talk tonight. Really interesting, and time has gone very quickly. Thank you ever so much for what you bring, not just tonight, but more generally to public discourse and to the church in terms of your scholarly work and your in my sort of language, your prophetic voice. Thank you very much, and thanks from all of us this evening.
Thank you.